Let us turn to W.K. Wimsatt, born in 1907 and passing in 1975, and Monroe Beardsley, born in 1915 and passing in 1985, two towering figures in American formalist criticism. Both were professors of English, literary theorists, philosophers of art, and critics whose work helped define mid-20th century critical principles. They are best remembered for developing two landmark concepts, the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy, articulated in their collaborative essays collected in The Verbal Icon. The intentional fallacy, which they famously described as the confusion between the poem and its origins, critiques the habit of relying on an author's personal life, stated aims, or other external information when interpreting a work. Wimsatt and Beardsley argued that such an approach is essentially equivalent to the genetic fallacy in philosophy, since even authors themselves are often unable to fully articulate or determine the intention behind a poem. For them, intentional criticism was inevitably subjective and therefore ceased to be legitimate criticism. In their view, the text should stand as an autonomous aesthetic object independent of its author's biography or declared purpose. Equally significant is the affective fallacy, defined as the confusion between the poem and its results. Here, they challenge impressionistic criticism, which judges literature primarily on the emotional effects it produces in readers. They warn that such an approach shifts critical focus from the work itself to its reception, turning literary study into nothing more than a subjective record of feelings. The affective fallacy makes it clear that a reader's emotional response cannot serve as a reliable measure of a work's value. Critical analysis must be rooted in textual evidence, not personal reaction. Beyond these two central ideas, Wimsatt also explored related questions in aesthetics, such as the concrete universal, asking whether verbal representation in literature should be general, as in purple cow, or highly specific, as in tan cow with a broken horn, to achieve the greatest effect. In his essay, The Domain of Criticism, Wimsatt defended poetry and poetics from being absorbed entirely into the broader study of aesthetics, questioning whether verbal art functions in the same way as visual forms like painting or sculpture. Together, Wimsatt and Beardsley's theoretical contributions reinforced the new critical emphasis on close reading and textual autonomy, shaping generations of literary scholarship and establishing critical methods that continue to influence how we interpret literature today. Let us now turn to F.R. Leavis, born in 1895 and passing in 1978, one of the most influential English literary critics of the early to mid-20th century. Leavis was renowned for his uncompromising standards and his insistence on the moral and cultural responsibilities of literature. His approach to criticism was grounded in objective analysis through close reading, treating literary study as a precise and disciplined intellectual activity. For Leavis, the ultimate purpose of literature was to humanize and civilize readers, fostering a deep moral awareness and a refined sensibility. His method combined an intense focus on the language and structure of a work with a concern for its moral and cultural significance, reflecting his belief that literature must engage with the deepest values of society. Leavis's influence extended far beyond his books. In 1932, alongside L.C. Knights, he co-founded the literary quarterly Scrutiny. For more than 2 decades, this periodical served as a platform for promoting rigorous moral and literary standards, shaping the direction of British literary criticism. Scrutiny embodied Leavis's ethos that criticism was inseparable from cultural responsibility by consistently advocating for literature that could sustain and enrich the intellectual and moral life of the community. Among his most notable works is New Bearings in English Poetry, published in 1932. This book marked Leavis's first major critical statement and offered a clear articulation of his critical principles. In New Bearings, he sought to redefine the English poetic tradition by reassessing the canon, notably downgrading figures such as Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold, whom he considered less central to its true development. While his work is frequently associated with the American school of new critics, given his emphasis on close reading and detailed textual analysis, Leavis retained a distinctive moral and cultural dimension. New bearings focus principally on the works of Gerard Manley Hopkins, W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound. These poets, in Leavis's view, represented modern poetry's most significant new achievements, combining technical innovation with intellectual rigor. Through New Bearings, Leavis championed a modern poetic sensibility capable of revitalizing the literary tradition itself. His critical career was also shaped in dialogue with his wife, Q.D. Leavis, whose fiction in the reading public offered a sociological study of literary taste. Together with Dennis Thompson, the couple co-authored Culture and Environment, a work examining the relationship between literature, education, and the cultural health of society. For F.R. Leavis, literature was never mere entertainment. It was a moral and cultural force, and criticism was a means of protecting and renewing that force for generations to come. Let's turn to 1948, when F.R. Leavis published his landmark critical work, The Great Tradition. In this book, Leavis established a highly selective canon of what he considered the great English novelists, emphatically declaring the great English novelists are Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad. For Leavis, these four authors represented the very highest achievements of the English novel, not only for their technical mastery, but for their ability to, as he put it, change the possibilities of art for practitioners and readers while also fostering an awareness of the possibilities of life. Although his focus remained firmly on this core quartet, Leavis did acknowledge other significant talents. He identified Charles Dickens, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe as literary figures who, in their imaginative scope, could be seen as successors to Shakespeare. Importantly, Leavis also added D.H. Lawrence to his pantheon of great novelists in English, though his more extensive discussion of Lawrence came in later works. Leavis's treatment of Dickens in The Great Tradition is especially nuanced. While he placed Dickens permanently among the classics and recognized him as a great genius and inevitable, Leavis qualified this praise. In his view, the genius was that of a great entertainer. Dickens, he argued, for the most part lacked the mature standards and interests found in Henry James, and he noted similar limitations when comparing Dickens's use of melodrama to that of Joseph Conrad, particularly in the statement found on page 19 of the book. His only notable exception was Hard Times, which he considered more closely aligned with the moral and artistic responsibility he so deeply valued. This careful distinction between granting Dickens' classic status and including him in the Great Tradition reflects Leavis's rigorous critical framework, one in which moral seriousness, artistic innovation, and the capacity to reshape literary form ultimately determine a novelist's lasting significance. Let us now turn to Cleanth Brooks, born in 1906 and passing in 1994, an American literary critic and professor whose work became foundational to the development of new criticism in the mid-20th century. Brooks is best remembered for his landmark books Modern Poetry and the Tradition, published in 1939, and The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, published in 1947. In these works, he advanced the argument that the central tools for understanding poetry are ambiguity and paradox. Brooks insisted on focusing on, in his own words, the interior life of a poem rather than its historical, biographical, or authorial background. This perspective helped codify the principles of close reading that became the hallmark of the new critical method. In The Well-Wrought Urn, Brooks argued that close reading is indispensable by making the closest examination of what the poem says as a poem, thereby reinforcing the idea that literary study is concerned primarily with the work itself. In his view, poetry is a self-contained and self-referential structure whose meaning and effect emerge from the interplay of its formal elements rather than from external context. Brooks's influence was not limited to poetry theory. He was also the preeminent critic of William Faulkner, producing detailed analyses of Faulkner's narrative structure, symbolism, and thematic complexity. Alongside Robert Penn Warren, he co-founded the influential journal The Southern Review, which, as noted by Leach in 2001, became a major platform for critical essays in the new critical tradition. In his essay, The Formalist Critics, Brooks clearly outlined some articles of faith to which he subscribed, reaffirming the central new critical tenet that structural and textual analysis should take precedence over historical or biographical interpretation. Through these writings, he not only shaped American literary criticism in the mid-century, but also established a lasting model for how poetry could be studied with precision, discipline, and interpretive rigor. Let's now turn to one of the most influential works of the new critical school, Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, published in 1947. The title comes from the fourth stanza of John Donne's The Canonization, and it signals Brooks's deep emphasis on form, structure, and the intricacy of poetic craft. The book is divided into 11 chapters. 10 of these offer exemplary close readings of English poems, ranging from Shakespeare's Macbeth to W.B. Yeats's Among School Children. Brooks calls these readings the concrete examples on which generalizations are to be based, showing his conviction that the meaning of a poem emerges organically from its structure and language, not from external historical or biographical contexts. The very first chapter, The Language of Paradox, sets the tone for the entire work. Here Brooks famously argues that paradox is not just a decorative element, but the very language of poetry. Through paradox, the reconciliation of seemingly contradictory ideas, poets like Donne, Milton, Wordsworth, Keats, Tennyson, and Eliot convey profound and nuanced truths. Then, in the final chapter, The Heresy of Paraphrase, Brooks delivers what has become a critical manifesto. He rejects the practice of reducing poems to mere prose summaries, insisting that such paraphrasing destroys the unity and complexity of a poem. For Brooks, a poem's meaning is inseparable from its formal organization. As he writes, a true poem is a simulacrum of reality, an experience rather than any mere statement about experience or any mere abstraction from experience. Following this chapter are two appendices: criticism, history, and critical relativism, and the problem of belief, which explore broader methodological and philosophical concerns. But the heart of Brooks's argument lies in his attack on the form-content split. Rather than seeing a poem as a container for detachable meaning, Brooks insists that form and meaning are inseparable, with meaning emerging only through the interplay of structure, rhythm, tension, balance, and irony. For Brooks, proper criticism must respond to these patterns, tonal shifts, and structural tensions, not just summarize a poem's propositional content. By denouncing paraphrase as inadequate, Brooks aligned new criticism with the aesthetic principles championed in the age of T.S. Eliot, firmly entrenching the movement's emphasis on close reading and the autonomous nature of the literary work. In short, The Well-Wrought Urn elevates paradox to the defining mode of poetic expression and makes the case that paraphrase is a betrayal of a poem's integrity, codifying the very principles that made new criticism a dominant force in mid-20th century literary study.